David set up camp at the scene of a brutal murder, not realizing the whispers outside belonged to the dead. He was a man of calculated risks and rigid structures, a 28-year-old software engineer from Chicago who viewed the world as a series of code blocks that simply needed to be arranged correctly to function. The Appalachian Trail was his latest project. He had optimized his gear weight down to the ounce, mapped his caloric intake, and plotted his daily mileage with the precision of a circuit board. There was no room in his spreadsheet for ghosts, and certainly no room for the unsolicited advice of a trembling geriatric in a roadside diner. It had been 4 hours earlier. The diner smelled of stale frying oil and lemon pledge. David sat in a booth with peeling red vinyl, nursing a black coffee and reviewing his topographic map. When the shadow fell over his table, he assumed it was the waitress with the check. Instead, it was the man from the counter, a local with skin like tanned leather and eyes that seemed to be looking at something far behind David's left shoulder. "You heading up to the ridge?" the old man said. It was not a question. His voice sounded like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. David offered a polite, dismissive smile. "Just passing through. Planning to hit the shelter at mile marker 402 tonight." "Whisper Ridge," the old man said, the name leaving his mouth like a curse. He reached out, his hand shaking, and placed a finger on the map, right on the small triangle marking the shelter. "Do not there. Not tonight." David pulled the map back slightly, annoyed by the intrusion. "I'm on a schedule. That's the only shelter for another 8 miles. I've checked the forums. It is structurally sound. It AI not the structure," the man whispered, leaning in close enough that David could smell the sourness of old tobacco on his breath. "The woods up there. They remember things that AI not meant to be replayed. You sleep there alone, you would not be sleeping alone." "I'll take my chances," David said, his tone sharpening. He threw a $10 bill on the table and stood up. "I'm from Chicago, pal. I can handle a few raccoons." The old man did not blink. He just watched David shoulder his pack, his expression one of profound, exhausted pity. "The dark do not care where you from, son. Just remember, if you hear them talking, do not answer. They are not talking to you." David walked out into the bright afternoon sun, shaking his head. He categorized the interaction under local color, a quirky anecdote to tell his coworkers when he returned to the concrete jungle. He was a rational man. He believed in what he could touch, measure, and verify. He did not believe in vague warnings from small-town eccentrics. The hike up was grueling but magnificent. The trail wound through a cathedral of ancient oaks, the leaves filtering the sunlight into a dappled mosaic of gold and green. By the time David reached the clearing, his legs burned with a satisfying fatigue. The shelter was exactly as the guidebooks described. A rustic, 3-sided lean-to made of rough-hewn logs, facing a stone fire pit. The roof was corrugated tin, rusted to a deep auburn. It looked peaceful. It looked empty. David dropped his pack on the wooden floorboards. The air here was cooler, thinner. The silence of the forest was absolute, lacking even the usual background hum of insects. He unpacked his gear with practiced efficiency. Sleeping bag unrolled, camp stove assembled, water filtered. He checked his watch. 7:45 p.m. Perfect timing. He ate his freeze-dried stroganoff watching the sun dip below the tree line. The transition from day to night in the deep woods was not gradual. It was a sudden surrender. The golden light vanished, replaced by a gray twilight that leached the color from the trees, turning them into skeletal silhouettes. David cleaned his spoon and pot, the scraping sound echoing unnaturally loud in the clearing. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to be quiet. It was not fear, not yet, but a primal instinct, a biological pressure on the base of his brain telling him that he was small and he was exposed. He retreated into the shelter. The open fourth wall faced the fire pit and the wall of trees beyond. He sat on his sleeping bag, turning on his headlamp. The beam cut a cone of white light through the darkness, illuminating dust motes and the gnarly bark of the nearest trees. Beyond that cone, the world simply ceased to exist. He tried to read his book, a biography of Tesla, but the words swam on the page. His mind kept drifting back to the diner. They are not talking to you. Ridiculous, he muttered aloud. His voice sounded flat, instantly swallowed by the vastness of the woods. He lay down, zipping his sleeping bag up to his chin. The floorboards beneath him were hard, but he was exhausted. He clicked off the headlamp. Blackness rushed in, heavy and absolute. David closed his eyes, focusing on his breathing, counting the inhales. He was a creature of logic. He was safe. He was alone. Then the wind died completely. The trees stopped rustling. The world held its breath. And in that vacuum of sound, just behind the rear wall of the shelter, a branch snapped. David's eyes snapped open. He lay perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His engineer's brain immediately went to work, calculating probabilities. Deer, bear, raccoon. Animals were clumsy. They stepped on dry wood. It was statistically the only explanation. He waited for the follow-up sound, the snort of a buck, the heavy huff of a bear. Instead, he heard the whisper. It was faint, barely brushing the edge of his hearing, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. But it had cadence. It had syntax. It was unmistakably human. Waited too long. The voice was low, male, and sounded wet, as if the speaker had too much saliva in their mouth. It came from directly behind the wooden planks David's head was resting against. David sat up slowly, the sleeping bag rustling. He froze, cursing the noise. He reached for his headlamp but hesitated. If there was someone out there, a drifter, a poacher, turning on the light would give away his position instantly. It would turn him into a target in a fishbowl. Did you hear that? A second voice whispered. This one was higher, tighter, laced with panic. It came from the left side of the shelter. Shoo! He's awake, the first voice replied. Ice water flooded David's veins. They were watching him. They knew he was there. The rational explanations, hikers arriving late, lost campers, evaporated. Hikers did not whisper in the dark. Hikers announced themselves. David's hand found the handle of his camping hatchet, which he had laid next to his boots. The cold rubber grip felt like a lifeline. He gripped it until his knuckles ached. Who's there? David called out. He tried to make his voice boom, to sound authoritative, but it cracked, sounding thin and terrified. I have a weapon. Identify yourself. Silence answered him. Not the peaceful silence of nature, but a heavy, expectant silence. It was the silence of a predator pausing before the pounce. Then the footsteps started. They did not approach the open front of the shelter. They began to circle. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Heavy bootfalls, slow and deliberate. David tracked the sound with his head, his eyes straining against the impenetrable dark. The sound moved from the left wall around to the back and then to the right. They were taunting him. I'm warning you, David shouted, swinging the unlit headlamp in his left hand like a flail. I'm calling the Rangers. A bluff. He had zero cell service. The footsteps stopped on the right side of the shelter, just out of sight. He thinks he can leave, the wet voice whispered, closer now. It sounded like the speaker was pressing their lips against the gaps in the logs. No one leaves, the panicked voice replied. Not tonight. David scrambled backward, pressing his back against the opposite wall, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the voices. His breath was coming in short, jagged gasps. He finally clicked on his headlamp, sweeping the beam frantically across the tree line. Nothing. The white light illuminated only trees, ferns, and the empty fire pit. There was no one there, yet the footsteps sounded like they were less than 10 feet away. Show yourselves, David screamed, the veneer of civilization stripping away. He was no longer an engineer, he was prey. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the back wall, exactly where his head had been moments ago. A rhythmic, gentle tapping. A fingernail on wood. Tap, tap, tap. It was playful, cruel. David spun around, shining the light on the solid wooden planks. There were no gaps large enough to see through, but the sound was intimate, right on the other side of the inch-thick timber. "Please," a third voice spoke. This one was different. It was not whispering. It was sobbing. A muffled, choked sobbing, like someone trying to scream through a gag. "Please, I did what you asked." David's stomach turned over. The sobbing was coming from the center of the clearing, directly in the beam of his light. But there was nothing there. The light cut through empty air, yet the sound was right in front of him. The sobbing grew louder, wetter, desperate. "Do not do this," the sobbing voice begged. "Take the money. Take the gear." David swung the hatchet at the empty air, losing his mind. "Where are you?" "He say not see us," the wet voice whispered, sounding amused. "Yes, blind." "Do it," the panicked voice hissed. "Do it now before he runs." David realized then that his flashlight was useless. His logic was useless. He was surrounded by invisible entities that were enacting a nightmare. He could not see but could hear in high-definition surround sound. He scrambled to the center of the shelter, crouching in a defensive ball, hatchet raised, trembling violently. The circling footsteps sped up. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Multiple sets of feet now, running around the shelter. A vortex of noise. The whispers rose into a cacophony of hushed arguments, manic giggling, and that terrible heart-wrenching sobbing. "Hold him down!" the wet voice roared, no longer a whisper. David squeezed his eyes shut and swung the hatchet blindly, screaming a primal sound of defiance and terror. A sickening thud echoed through the clearing. Not the sound of David's hatchet hitting anything, but the sound of a heavy object striking flesh and bone. It came from right in front of the fire pit. David opened his eyes. The clearing was still empty. The beam of his headlamp cut through the dust. "No! No, please!" The sobbing voice shrieked, a sound of pure, jagged agony that tore through the night. Another thud. A wet, tearing sound. Then the distinct noise of a body hitting the dirt. David stopped breathing. He was frozen, his mind unable to process the sensory dissonance. He was watching an empty clearing, but his ears were witnessing a murder. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The old man's warning. The woods remember. He was not under attack. Not in the way he thought. The voices, they were not talking about him. "Check his pockets," the wet voice commanded. The voice was panting, exerted. "Get the keys." "There's so much blood," the panicked voice stammered. "You said it would be clean. You said just a scare." "Shut up and help me drag him." David watched in horror as the leaves near the fire pit depressed, dragging in a line toward the woods, as if an invisible weight was being pulled across them. The sound of heels dragging in the dirt was unmistakable. He lowered the hatchet. He was not the victim. He was the audience. He was sitting in the front row of a theater of the damned, watching a 15-year-old tragedy replay itself. Hope surged in his chest. A desperate, sickly hope. If this was a recording, a ghostly echo, then they could not hurt him. They were just sound. Memories trapped in the atmosphere. He just had to wait it out. He just had to sit here, close his eyes, and wait for the scene to end. "It's just a ghost story," David whispered to himself, rocking back and forth. "It's just residual energy. Physics. Acoustics. It's not real." He clicked off his headlamp to save the battery, deciding to hide in the dark until morning. If they could not see him, he did not need to see them. The dragging sounds faded into the woods. The silence returned. David exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. He had survived. It was over. The scene had finished. He leaned his head back against the wooden wall, exhaustion washing over him like a rogue wave. He closed his eyes. Creak. The floorboard directly in front of his boots groaned under the weight of a heavy step. David's eyes flew open. The darkness was absolute. "Who is that?" The wet voice spoke. It was not a recording. The voice was directly in front of his face, so close he could feel the cold displacement of air. "I see him," the voice whispered. "He is sitting right where Jake was." David's heart stopped. The logic crumbled again. This was not just a recording. They were aware. The past was not just replaying. It was overlapping. The killers, or the spirits of the killers, were still here, and they had found a new actor for their play. He thinks we see not touch him. The panicked voice giggled from the corner of the shelter. Let us show him. The wet voice snarled. A cold, unseen hand clamped around David's ankle. The grip was solid. It was freezing, like gripping a block of dry ice, but it had mass. It had strength. David screamed, kicking out wildly. His boot connected with something solid, something that felt like a ribcage. A grunt of pain erupted from the empty air. Grab him! David was not fighting ghosts. He was fighting a force that bridged the gap between the living and the dead. He scrambled backward, clawing at the wooden wall, but the grip on his ankle tightened, dragging him toward the open mouth of the shelter, toward the dark woods where the other body had gone. David's fingernails splintered against the rough floorboards. He was being dragged inch by inch toward the darkness. The physics of it made no sense, but the pain in his ankle was excruciatingly real. He was not an engineer anymore. He was an animal fighting for survival. He kicked again, his free foot flailing into the void. He connected with the invisible presence again, hard. The grip loosened for a fraction of a second. It was enough. David scrambled to his feet, abandoning his hatchet, his pack, his shoes, everything. He lunged out of the shelter, not into the woods where the body had been dragged, but onto the trail heading south. Get him! The voices shrieked in unison, a chorus of rage that sounded like wind howling through a cavern. David ran. He ran blindly, barefoot over roots and sharp stones, his socks tearing, his feet bleeding. He did not feel it. Adrenaline acted as a total anesthetic. He crashed through rhododendron bushes, whipped by branches that sliced his cheeks. Behind him, the forest was alive. Heavy footsteps pursued him. Not the rhythmic steps of hikers, but the chaotic, thundering charge of a hunt. He could hear them crashing through the brush, getting closer. Do not let him tell. Cut him. David's lungs burned like he had inhaled glass. He saw a break in the trees ahead, the moonlight hitting the gravel of a service road that intersected the trail a mile down. He pushed his body beyond its limits, his vision tunneling. He burst onto the service road, the gravel tearing into his feet, and collapsed in the center of the lane, gasping, waiting for the blow to fall. He waited. Silence. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the distant chirp of crickets. The treeline stood motionless, a dark wall of indifference. The footsteps had stopped at the edge of the woods. David lay there until the sky turned purple, then gray, then pink. He did not move until a logging truck rumbled down the road at dawn. The driver, a burly man in a plaid shirt, slammed on his brakes when he saw the bloodied, barefoot figure shivering on the gravel. 2 hours later, David sat in the same booth at the diner. He was wrapped in a wool blanket provided by the sheriff's deputy. His feet were bandaged. He had not spoken a word since they picked him up. The bell above the door jingled. Elias, the old man, walked in from the back carrying a crate of produce. He stopped when he saw David. He did not look surprised. He did not say, "I told you so." He just walked over, sat in the booth opposite David, and placed a fresh cup of coffee on the table. "Did you see them?" Elias asked softly. David stared into the black liquid. His hands were shaking so bad the coffee rippled in concentric circles. I heard them. They killed someone. A guy named Jake." Elias nodded slowly, his eyes heavy with ancient sadness. "Jake Mitchell. 15 years ago today. He was a good kid. Just wanted to see the stars." "They dragged him?" David whispered, the memory of the sound making bile rise in his throat. "They dragged him into the woods. But they grabbed me, Elias. They touched me. They knew I was there." Elias leaned forward. "The men who killed Jake, they were never caught. Locals say they were drifters, hopped a train out of town the next morning. But the hate, the violence of what they did, it stained that place. Like a groove in a record, playing over and over. But they touched me, David insisted, looking up, his eyes wild and bloodshot. Records do not touch you. Elias looked away, toward the window where the forested hills loomed in the distance. Sometimes the groove gets deep enough that it pulls other things in. You did not just hear the past, son. You became part of the loop. If you had not run, I would have ended up like Jake, David finished. Or worse, Elias said grimly. You might have ended up like the ones doing the dragging. David left Chicago a week later. He quit his job. He sold his hiking gear on eBay. He moved to a high-rise apartment in downtown Seattle, as far from the Appalachian woods as he could get without leaving the continent. He surrounded himself with concrete, steel, and noise. He needed the constant hum of the city to drown out the silence. He thought he was safe. He thought distance mattered. But trauma is not a location. It is a frequency. 6 months later, David woke up at 3:00 a.m. His luxury apartment was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. He rolled over, pulling the duvet up. He was safe. He was 2,000 miles away. Then he heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, rhythmic, coming from the drywall directly behind his headboard. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was just the pipes. It was just the building settling. He thinks he got away. A wet voice whispered from inside the wall. No one leaves. The panicked voice answered from the closet. David squeezed his eyes shut as the footsteps began to circle his bed on the plush carpet. He realized then that he had not escaped Whisper Ridge. He had simply brought the signal home with him.